July 17, 1943, 14:30 hours. Moscow, Soviet Union. General Andrei Vasilievich Krylev stood before a warehouse door, his uniform soaked with sweat. Outside, the temperature hovered at 28 degrees Celsius. A scorching summer day. Inside this nondescript building on the outskirts of Moscow, wooden crates stretched into darkness. 400,000 winter coats, each. One padded with wool, each one designed to survive temperatures of -40. 6 months late. Krylev was 50 years old, a logistics specialist who had risen through the ranks managing supply chains most generals found beneath their notice. While Zhukov planned offensives and Rokossovsky commanded armies, Krylev counted boots. He tracked ammunition. He scheduled trains. His was the mathematics of war, the unglamorous arithmetic that kept 3 million soldiers fed, armed, and moving. He had requested these coats in October 1942. They were needed for the winter offensive. They should have arrived in December, when temperatures plummeted and frostbite began claiming more casualties than German bullets. Instead, they arrived now, when soldiers were stripping to their undershirts in the oppressive heat. The irony wasn't lost on him, neither was the mathematics. 400,000 coats. At $15 per unit, $6 million of material. Enough to build 200 T-34 tanks. Enough to produce 3 million artillery shells, all of it sitting uselessly in a sweltering warehouse, while frontline troops fought in summer tunics. But the tragedy extended far beyond wasted money. Krylev opened a leather-bound journal and traced his finger down a column of numbers. January 1943, 37,892 frostbite casualties. February, 28,445 casualties. March, 19,203 casualties. These weren't projections. These were men, sergeants who lost toes, riflemen who lost fingers, machine gunners who would never hold a weapon again. 85,540 Soviet soldiers evacuated due to cold injuries during the 3 months when these coats should have been on their backs. He closed the journal. The mathematics told a story more brutal than any after-action report. The Soviet Union was winning the war through sheer industrial might. 100,000 tanks produced, 130,000 aircraft, weapons output that dwarfed anything Nazi Germany could manufacture. But coordination was a catastrophe. Factories fulfilled quotas without asking what the front lines actually needed. Transportation networks moved supplies without prioritizing what mattered most. The command economy operated at maximum capacity with minimum efficiency. A junior officer approached with a clipboard. "Comrade General, what should we do with them?" Krylev stared at the crates. What could they do? Store them for next winter? Ship them to the front now, wasting precious rail capacity that could move ammunition instead? The system had no mechanism for feedback, no way to correct course once the production machinery began its inexorable march. "Store them," he finally said. "We'll need them again in December." If the mathematics held true, they would need them desperately, because the same system that delivered winter coats in July was also overproducing ammunition nobody could transport, manufacturing spare parts for tanks that didn't exist, and generating mountains of supplies that would never reach the soldiers who needed them. The Soviet Union was an industrial colossus with the coordination ability of a blind giant, and Krylev knew something else, something that would haunt him for the rest of his career. The story would repeat itself, over and over, because in a command economy without feedback mechanisms, past mistakes became future certainties. To understand how 400,000 winter coats arrived in July, you must first understand the machinery of Soviet production, a system simultaneously magnificent and monstrous. The numbers tell the first part of the story. In 1943, Soviet factories produced 24,089 tanks and self-propelled guns. American factories produced 29,497 tanks the same year. But here's what makes the Soviet achievement remarkable. They did this while 1/3 of their territory remained under German occupation. They did this after evacuating 1,500 factories eastward, literally dismantling industrial complexes and reassembling them beyond the Urals. They did this while their agricultural heartland burned and their most productive regions served as battlefields. Aircraft production reached 34,845 units in 1943. Artillery pieces exceeded 130,000. Small arms production topped 3 million rifles. The Soviet industrial machine had transformed itself into the largest military manufacturing complex in human history. But manufacturing was only half the equation. The other half was logistics, and here the system began to crack. General Krylov's domain encompassed a network of staggering complexity. The Soviet railway system stretched across 11 time zones, covering distances that dwarfed anything in Western Europe. Main supply bases, called center bases of the People's Commissariat of Defense, stockpiled mountains of equipment. From these bases, supplies moved via rail to front bases, then to army bases, then to division bases, and finally to regimental supply points. Each transfer required coordination. Each handoff created opportunity for delay. Each decision point introduced the possibility of error. The command economy operated through quotas. Factory directors received production targets: manufacture X tanks, Y rifles, Z uniforms. Success meant meeting the quota. Failure meant disgrace, possibly death. So factories optimized for one metric above all others, hitting their numbers. Nobody asked whether the front lines needed tanks or ammunition. Nobody questioned whether summer uniforms mattered more than winter coats. The plan dictated production. The plan was sacred. The plan was mathematically perfect, in theory. In practice, the plan was written months in advance by bureaucrats in Moscow who couldn't possibly predict battlefield requirements. When General Zhukov needed ammunition for the Battle of Kursk, planners had already allocated production months earlier. When winter offensives required cold weather gear, factories were manufacturing according to quotas set before anyone knew winter operations would occur. The result? Systematic misalignment between production and need. Consider ammunition production in 1943. Soviet factories manufactured approximately 275 million artillery shells, mortars, and rockets. This represented a triumph of industrial organization. An average of 750,000 shells produced every single day. But the Soviet railway system could transport only 200 million shells to the front lines. The mathematics of waste. 75 million shells sat in warehouses. 27% of total production never reached the soldiers who needed it. While frontline units rationed ammunition, 20 shells per gun per day instead of 50, millions of rounds gathered dust hundreds of kilometers away. Why couldn't they transport more? The railway system faced its own constraints. Locomotives required maintenance. Tracks needed repair. Freight cars were finite. And here's the critical point. Nobody had authority to change the transportation schedule. The plan allocated specific numbers of trains to specific supply categories. Ammunition received X trains. Food received Y trains. Winter coats received Z trains. Even when warehouses overflowed with ammunition, the system couldn't redirect trains. That would mean deviating from the plan, and deviating from the plan meant chaos. The winter coat debacle followed the same pattern. In October 1942, Krylev submitted a requisition: 400,000 winter coats needed by December 1st for winter offensive operations. The requisition entered the bureaucratic machine. First, it went to the People's Commissariat of Defense Logistics Department. They verified the request against planned operations. Approved. Second, it went to the State Planning Committee, Gosplan, which allocated production to specific factories. Factory number 47 in Ivanovo would produce 200,000 coats. Factory number 83 in Kazan would produce 200,000 more. Third, the Cotton Allocation Committee assigned raw materials. Fourth, the Transportation Committee scheduled rail shipments. Fifth, quality control inspectors planned inspection schedules. By the time the bureaucratic machine finished processing Krylev's October request, winter had arrived. The coats were still being manufactured, and soldiers were freezing. January 1943 brought Operation Little Saturn and Operation Gallop, major offensives across the southern front. Temperatures dropped to -25 Celsius. Soviet troops advanced rapidly, outrunning their supply lines. Units fought in inadequate clothing because winter gear remained stuck in production queues. The frostbite casualties mounted with brutal efficiency. A soldier with frostbitten fingers couldn't fire his rifle. A soldier with frostbitten feet couldn't march. A soldier with severe frostbite required evacuation to field hospitals already overwhelmed with combat wounded. Soviet military medicine documented 90,881 frostbite cases requiring hospitalization across the entire war. The worst concentrations occurred in the winters of 1941, 1942, and 1942, 1943. Conservative estimates suggest over 100,000 soldiers suffered cold injuries severe enough to remove them from frontline duty during those critical months. Each casualty represented a gap in the line. Each evacuation meant another replacement needed, and replacements required training, equipment, and time. The winter coats finally completed production in May 1943. By then, temperatures had risen above freezing. But the railway schedule remained unchanged. The coats were allocated X number of trains departing on Y schedule, regardless of whether summer had arrived. So, in July, 400,000 winter coats reached Moscow warehouses. Perfect coats, well-manufactured coats, utterly useless coats. The system had succeeded at production and failed at coordination. And this was not an anomaly. This was the system operating exactly as designed. The winter of 1942-1943 arrived like a hammer. December 12, 1942. Operation Winter Storm begins. A German attempt to relieve the encircled 6th Army at Stalingrad. Soviet forces counterattack. Temperatures plunge to -32°C. Snow transforms the steppe into a white hell where metal becomes too cold to touch without gloves. Private Ivan Sokolov, 21st Army, 4th Guards Rifle Division, doesn't have winter gloves. He wraps strips of cloth around his hands, but the fabric does little against the cold that bites through everything. Within 48 hours, the tips of 3 fingers on his left hand turn white, then grey. The company medic recognizes frostbite immediately. 2nd degree. Possibly 3rd. Sokolov can't grip his Mosin Nagant rifle properly anymore. He's evacuated. His position is filled by a replacement. The division continues advancing. Multiply Sokolov by thousands, tens of thousands. The mathematics of frostbite cascade through entire arm. In the Soviet medical system, frostbite casualties followed a brutal progression. 1st degree, skin damage, recoverable within days. 2nd degree, tissue damage, requiring weeks of treatment. 3rd degree, permanent damage, possible amputation, soldier removed from service permanently. During January 1943 alone, field hospitals across the southern and southwestern fronts processed 37,892 frostbite cases, not battlefield wounds, not combat injuries, simply men who fought in temperatures their clothing couldn't protect against. The 5th Tank Army provides a microcosm of the disaster. Formed in February 1943 for offensive operations, the Army fielded 563 tanks and 45,000 personnel. Within 2 weeks of winter combat, the Army reported about 1,847 frostbite casualties, 4.1% of total strength removed, not by German guns, but by inadequate cold weather equipment. Tank crews suffered particularly brutal conditions. Inside a T-34, temperatures could drop to -20°C. Crews wore whatever they could scavenge: civilian coats, German overcoats captured in combat, multiple layers of summer uniforms. The lucky ones found felt boots. The unlucky ones lost toes. Why didn't they have proper winter gear? Because the winter gear sat in production queues. Because factories prioritized quota fulfillment over delivery schedules. Because the transportation network allocated trains according to central planning, not battlefield urgency. But here's where the story becomes more complex. The Soviet system wasn't simply incompetent. It was optimized for a different metric. Consider the German winter experience. During the winter of 1941-1942, the Wehrmacht suffered catastrophic cold casualties. Estimates range from 100,000 to 250,000 frostbite cases. German logistics completely collapsed. The vaunted German military machine, celebrated for its precision, failed to deliver winter clothing to troops who expected to be in Moscow by autumn. The Soviet system, by contrast, delivered massive quantities of winter equipment, just not on time. And therein lies the distinction. Soviet factories produced 15 million winter coats during the war. They manufactured 69 million pairs of felt boots, valenki, the traditional Russian winter footwear. They generated mountains of winter uniforms, added jackets, fur hats, and cold weather gear. The volume was extraordinary. The timing was disastrous. In July 1943, while Kulyov stared at 400,000 unused winter coats, another logistics catastrophe was unfolding. The ammunition surplus. Soviet artillery dominated the Eastern Front. The 76 mm divisional gun, the 122 mm howitzer, the legendary Katyusha rocket systems, these weapons consumed ammunition at rates that would have bankrupted any other nation. During the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, Soviet artillery fired over 2.5 million shells in the first week alone, yet warehouses bulged with excess ammunition. The mathematics revealed the problem. Soviet factories produced shells faster than railways could transport them. Production exceeded transportation capacity by 37.5%. Why didn't they reduce production and increase transportation? Because production quotas were sacred. Factory directors who failed to meet quotas faced consequences ranging from dismissal to execution. Factory directors who exceeded quotas received medals and promotions. The system incentivized maximum production regardless of actual need. Transportation, meanwhile, operated under different constraints. Railway locomotives were finite. Track capacity was limited. Repair schedules were inflexible. The State Defense Committee allocated X number of trains to ammunition, Y number to food, Z number to fuel. These allocations changed slowly through bureaucratic processes that required weeks or months. So ammunition piled up in central warehouses while frontline units rationed shells. Winter coats arrived in summer while soldiers froze in winter. The system produced abundance and scarcity simultaneously. Lieutenant Mikhail Petrov commanded an artillery battery during the Kursk battle. His unit received 20 shells per gun per day, enough for harassing fire, insufficient for sustained bombardment. Yet 100 kilometers behind the lines, warehouses held 12,000 shells his battery could have used. The shells existed, the transportation didn't. Petrov's battery fired its rationed ammunition, then waited for resupply while German positions remained intact. His guns were capable. His crews were trained. What he lacked was coordination between production and delivery. This wasn't sabotage. It wasn't incompetence. It was the predictable result of a command economy optimizing for production metrics rather than battlefield outcomes. Compare this to American logistics. When the U.S. Army needed ammunition in Europe, depot commanders could adjust transportation priorities within days. If artillery units required more shells, fewer rations were shipped. If winter gear became critical, ammunition shipments decreased. The system had flexibility because local commanders possessed authority to make decisions. The Soviet system concentrated all authority at the top. Local initiative was discouraged. Deviating from the plan was dangerous. So supplies moved according to central directives written months in advance, regardless of current battlefield conditions. The human cost was immense, but difficult to quantify. How many soldiers died because ammunition rationing forced attacks to proceed without adequate artillery preparation? How many frostbite victims could have remained combat effective with proper winter gear? How many operations failed because logistics couldn't adapt to changing circumstances? The Soviet Union won the war despite these failures, not because of them. They won through sheer volume, producing so much that even catastrophic waste left enough to achieve victory. They won through sacrifice, soldiers fighting in inadequate gear, units advancing without adequate supply, offensives succeeding through determination rather than coordination. But the victory came at a price measured not just in casualties but in squandered potential. Every frostbite case represented a trained soldier removed from combat. Every shell sitting uselessly in a warehouse represented firepower that could have saved lives. Every winter coat arriving in July represented industrial capacity spent without strategic benefit. The story of 400,000 winter coats arriving in July is not a story about coats. It's a story about systems, how they succeed, how they fail, and why sometimes the same characteristics enable both outcomes simultaneously. Step back from individual warehouses and tactical failures. Examine the industrial landscape of 1943. The Soviet Union was fighting the largest land war in human history while simultaneously executing the most ambitious industrial mobilization ever attempted. Between 1941 and 1943, the Soviets evacuated 1523 factories from threatened western regions to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. This wasn't simply moving equipment. Entire industrial ecosystems were dismantled. Factories, power stations, housing for workers, transportation infrastructure. 10 million people relocated. Railway cars carried machine tools instead of supplies. Production halted for months while factories reassembled in new locations. Yet by 1943, these evacuated factories were outproducing their pre-war levels. Tank production tripled. Aircraft production quadrupled. The Soviets transformed agricultural regions into industrial centers within 2 years. How? Through the command economy's greatest strength, total mobilization without market constraints. In a capitalist system, industrial conversion requires negotiation. Companies must be convinced or compelled to abandon profitable consumer production for military contracts. Workers must be incentivized to relocate. Capital must be redirected through complex financial mechanisms. The Soviet command economy simply ordered conversion. Factory directors received new plans. Workers received relocation orders. Capital flowed where the state directed. No negotiation, no market signals, just commands backed by the coercive power of the state. This enabled unprecedented speed, but speed came at a cost: flexibility. Consider the American industrial system during the same period. By 1943, American factories were producing 85,000 aircraft annually, more than any other nation. But American production remained responsive to military needs. When the Army Air Force requested more long-range bombers, production shifted. When tank destroyer doctrine proved flawed, manufacturing priorities changed. The Soviet system couldn't pivot quickly. Changing production plans required approvals through multiple bureaucratic layers. Gosplan set annual targets. Deviating from targets meant revising the entire economic plan. The command economy was like turning a supertanker. Tremendous power, minimal maneuverability. This explains the winter coat tragedy. Once Gosplan allocated production of 400,000 coats to specific factories with specific delivery dates, changing that plan required extraordinary justification. The need for coats in December seemed obvious, but proving that need, documenting it, passing it through approval chains, and revising production schedules took longer than simply manufacturing the coats on the original timeline. So the coats arrived in July, on schedule, according to plan. Completely useless. The ammunition surplus followed identical logic. Factories received quotas to produce 275 million shells. They produced 275 million shells. That the railway system could only transport 200 million shells was someone else's problem. Factory directors fulfilled their quotas. Railway directors moved their allocated tonnage. Both succeeded at their assigned tasks. The system failed at integration. Now compare this to German logistics, often praised for Prussian efficiency. The Wehrmacht operated under a different philosophy. Tactical excellence overcomes logistical limitations. German doctrine emphasized small, highly trained units using superior equipment to achieve decisive results. This worked brilliantly when campaigns were short. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, succeeded by moving faster than supply lines. But when campaigns extended beyond initial planning, German logistics collapsed. The Wehrmacht never solved its transportation problems. German units in Russia often fought on captured Soviet supplies because their own logistics couldn't keep pace. The Soviets solved the opposite problem. They built a logistics system capable of sustaining multi-year industrial warfare. But they couldn't make it responsive. The British took a third approach: methodical build-up before offensive operations. Field Marshal Montgomery famously refused to attack until supply stockpiles reached predetermined levels. British doctrine accepted slower operations in exchange for logistical certainty. Each system reflected national characteristics and economic structures. The Soviets had centralized control and abundant raw materials. The Americans had industrial capacity and capital. The Germans had tactical excellence and engineering sophistication. The British had imperial resources and methodical planning. The Soviet system won in the East not because it was more efficient, but because it was more sustainable. It could afford waste, it could absorb failures, it could continue producing despite catastrophic losses because the entire economy was directed toward one goal: defeat Germany. Between 1941 and 1945, the Soviet Union produced 102,500 tanks and self-propelled guns, 157,261 aircraft, 516,648 artillery pieces, 95 million small arms, 775 million artillery shells. These numbers exceeded German production by factors of 2 to 4. They matched or exceeded American production despite the Soviets having a smaller industrial base and fighting on their own territory. But the statistics hide the dysfunction. For every tank that reached the front, 2 broke down from poor quality control. For every aircraft produced, critical spare parts remained in warehouses. For every successful operation, supplies arrived late, incomplete, or in the wrong quantities. The Soviet military won through multiplication. They compensated for 40% waste by producing 300% more. They offset coordination failures by generating such abundance that even the fraction that reached frontline troops exceeded German availability. This was industrial warfare reduced to its mathematical essence: volume over efficiency, quantity over quality, sustainability over perfection. But the mathematics had a human cost. The 85,540 frostbite casualties during winter 1942-1943 were preventable. The artillery batteries that rationed ammunition during critical battles were avoidable. The $6 million spent on summer-delivered winter coats could have saved lives if spent differently. Krulyov understood this. His memoirs, written after the war, reflect profound frustration with the system he served loyally but recognized was fundamentally flawed. "We built the largest military logistics system in history," he wrote in 1958, "and we did so without any mechanism to learn from our mistakes." This was the command economy's fatal flaw. No feedback loop. Markets respond to failure through price signals. Successful products become more expensive, directing resources toward their production. Unsuccessful products become cheaper, redirecting resources elsewhere. The Soviet system had no such mechanism. Success and failure both generated the same response: meet the quota. Factories produced what planners ordered, regardless of whether frontline troops needed it. The system optimized for plan fulfillment, not battlefield effectiveness. Yet it worked. Barely, wastefully, tragically. But it worked. July 1945, 2 years after the winter coats arrived, General Andrei Krulyov stands in Berlin, watching Soviet troops celebrate in the ruins of the Reichstag. The war in Europe is over. The Soviet Union has won. And Krulyov knows the victory came despite the system, not because of it. He returns to Moscow carrying 2 leather notebooks. One contains production statistics, the triumphant numbers that will fill official histories. 100,000 tanks produced, a nation mobilized, an industrial miracle accomplished. The other notebook contains the winter coats in July, the ammunition surpluses while frontline units rationed shells, the spare parts that never matched the equipment they were meant to repair, the coordination failures that cost thousands of preventable casualties. This second notebook never appears in official records, but it shapes everything Krulyov does for the rest of his career. After the war, Krulyov becomes one of the primary architects of Soviet military logistics reform. He advocates for decentralized authority, allowing field commanders to adjust supply priorities. He pushes for better coordination between production and transportation. He argues that the command economy must develop feedback mechanisms, ways to learn from failure rather than simply fulfilling quotas. Some reforms succeed. The Soviet logistics system of the 1950s becomes more flexible than its wartime predecessor. Local commanders gain limited authority to redirect supplies. Transportation planning incorporates real-time information from the front lines. But fundamental problems remain. The command economy's basic structure, centralized planning, quota-driven production, top-down authority, continues unchanged. The system that delivered winter coats in July persists into the Cold War and beyond. The human cost of those coordination failures is difficult to calculate, but impossible to ignore. Conservative estimates suggest 90,000 plus Soviet soldiers suffered preventable frostbite casualties between 1941 and 1943. Add ammunition shortages that extended battles and increased casualties. Add equipment failures from poor quality spare parts. Add operational delays from logistics breakdowns. These weren't the dramatic casualties of combat. They were the quiet losses of systemic dysfunction. A soldier who lost fingers to frostbite because his winter coat arrived 6 months late. An artillery crew that died in a failed assault because ammunition rationing prevented adequate preparation. A tank destroyed because replacement parts never reached the repair depot. The mathematics of these losses never appears in official statistics. And they were preventable. Yet here's the paradox that haunted Krulyov until his death in 1962. The same system that generated these failures also produced the abundance that won the war. The command economy's inability to coordinate efficiently was paired with its ability to produce massively. The same centralized control that couldn't deliver coats on time also evacuated 1,500 factories and kept them producing through impossible circumstances. Could the Soviet Union have won using a different system? Krulyov believed yes, but recognized his nation never had that choice. The command economy was embedded in Soviet political structure. Changing the economic system meant changing the political system, and that was impossible. So the Soviet Union won the bloodiest war in history using a logistics system that worked through sheer overwhelming force rather than efficient coordination. They buried their mistakes under mountains of production. They compensated for waste through abundance. They achieved victory despite dysfunction because they could afford the cost. This is not the heroic narrative taught in Soviet schools or celebrated in Russian war memorials, but it may be the most important lesson of the Eastern Front. In modern warfare, industrial capacity matters more than tactical brilliance. Logistics determines outcomes more than battlefield courage. And sometimes, a flawed system that produces abundance defeats a refined system that produces scarcity. The 400,000 winter coats that arrived in July sit in a warehouse somewhere in Russia to this day. Nobody knows their exact location. They were never issued. They were never destroyed. They simply vanished into the vast Soviet logistics network. One more data point in the mathematics of industrial warfare. But their story endures because it reveals a truth that extends far beyond World War II. In complex systems, production and coordination are separate challenges. Solving one doesn't solve the other. And sometimes, the system that maximizes production is the same system that minimizes coordination. The Soviet Union proved you could win despite this contradiction, but the victory came at a terrible cost, measured not just in soldiers' lives but in squandered potential. Every winter coat that arrived too late, every shell that stayed in a warehouse, every soldier who suffered preventable injury represented industrial capacity spent without strategic benefit. Khrushchev understood this. He spent his final years trying to reform the system that both enabled victory and ensured tragedy. His efforts achieved limited success. The command economy persisted, and with it the coordination failures that marked Soviet logistics throughout the Cold War. But his notebooks survived, and in them a simple truth. We won because we produced more than the enemy could destroy. We could have won with far less sacrifice if we had learned to coordinate what we produced. That is the lesson. Whether anyone will learn it remains to be seen. If this exploration of industrial warfare's hidden mathematics resonated with you, consider subscribing. We examine the stories where logistics defeated tactics, where systems determined destinies, where the real battles were fought not on front lines but in factories and railway yards. Tell us in the comments what other untold stories of World War II logistics should we explore. How do you think modern military systems handle the coordination challenges that plagued Soviet logistics? The war was won not by heroes alone, but by the unglamorous mathematics of supply, production, and transportation. That story deserves to be told and remembered.